Hello, everyone. You've just received that dreaded email or phone call from your boss. She's invited you to come speak at the next management meeting about the great project that you and your team are working on. Of course, you readily accept and agree, but for a brief moment, your heart sinks a little bit because let's face it, most of us don't like to do presentations. But we're going to, through this short video, show you how do you capture their attention, whether you're talking for 5 minutes or 5 hours. It's really important to look at how do I create a powerful presentation that not only serves the purpose of me transferring information, but gives my audience what they need and gets them excited about the work I'm doing. So how are we going to do that? Why do you want to keep watching this video? Well, first of all, we're going to show you 7 simple steps of how you define your scope. Then we're going to show you a couple of great tools on how you actually lay out your presentation for maximum impact. We're going to give you a couple of questions to ask yourself to kind of verify or validate, yep, I'm meeting the needs of my audience and the scope of my presentation. And we're also going to give you some tips about how you get them to pay attention to you and not looking at their email or at other screens. So let's get started. One of the first things we want to do is really be clear about what is our scope. In order to do that, there are 7 things that we need to define. Number 1 is we're going to walk through, you need to know your audience. Who's in the room, who's on the call, who's in the Zoom room. We need to start with the end in mind. What is it you want them to walk away with? We need to explain the why factor. I call this pulling the thread through. Why is what you're working on or presenting so important to them, and what's the impact? We're going to talk a little bit about storytelling because making that emotional connection is really critical for people to have some kind of ownership or engagement with what you're sharing. We're going to talk then about how you lay this all out so that it's in an approach that people can understand and can follow. There needs to be a beginning, middle, and end. We're also going to be talking about a picture is worth 1,000 words, how we use imagery to reduce the amount of clutter on our slides. And probably the most important step is taking a little bit of time to practice. So let's jump in and get started. The first thing you want to do is really analyze and think about who's my audience, who's sitting around the table, why are they there, what's their level, how is this project impacting them or the information you're sharing? What are their styles and backgrounds? Are they a more quiet group, an extroverted group? Do they like a lot of details? Do they like more of a high level flyover? Really understanding who is going to be on the phone or in the room is really critical. The next thing you really want to think about is what do they want to get out of it? So many times when we present, we talk from our vantage point. What's really critical is if you put yourself on their side of the phone or the screen, and what do they want to walk away with? Why is what you're working on or sharing interesting to them? What can they do with it? Why do they want to spend some of their time focused on it? Then we also want to make sure what's the best way to reach them. And this is where we're going to talk about storytelling in a few minutes. How are we going to motivate and persuade them to not only listen to you, but then do something with the information you're sharing? I'm a big one about having call to actions. I don't want to just share information. I want to make sure people understand what to do with it. And the last step here is to think about how much time you have. Give you a quick story. I recently was facilitating a session where someone was asked to give a 10-minute presentation. They went over by an additional 10 minutes. Not only was the information that they shared out of scope, they did not clearly define who their audience was and why they needed this information. And what happened is it threw the rest of the session off track. So one of the things that's really critical is if you only have 5 minutes, spend 5 minutes. If you have 5 hours, spend 5 hours, but try to be really aware of that time element. So take a moment right now. You could either pause the video or just I'll pause for a second and just take a little bit of a think about who are the audiences you typically talk to and what do they want to get out of your presentation. So pause, or you can do this later on. The next thing we want to do is I always call this starting with the end in mind. It's kind of like going on a trip. We have to pick our destination or our location and where we want to go. And then we put our plan on how we're going to get there. It's kind of like if you're going to go on a skiing trip and you pack your bathing suit. We want to make sure that we start at the end in mind. How we do this in presentations is we want to think about what are those 1, 2, even 3 key messages that you want your audience to walk away with. Now, if you have a 5-minute presentation, I would say it's probably 1 key message. If you have a 45 or an hour, they could probably withstand up to 2 or 3 key messages. Again, think about there's only so much people can process and internalize. So what's the biggest bang for your buck for the time that you have? And then also, what do you want them to do with this information? I'm a big one of sharing, this is just for your information. I want you to communicate this with the rest of your teams. We need to funnel this over to another team in order so they can act, but what do they do with it? So again, beginning, middle, and end, start at the end. This is a part that's often missed. I call it the why factor. I joke with people often and say, how many of you know a 3-year-old, have owned a 3-year-old, have been around a 3-year-old? And people chuckle and laugh. And we say, what do 3-year-olds do? They consistently ask why. And this is something we kind of lose as we get higher up in education and into the corporate world or into the business world. It's really vital that you explain to your audience why this information is so important to them. Well, again, what's that WIFM for them? What are they going to do with it? Why do they care? And this is a great place to insert a story or an example to make that connection. How is what you're sharing impacting their world? Because let's face it, we start with us and then cascade out from there. So that why factor is really a very important one. And this leads to storytelling. I put Once Upon a Time on a screen and a picture of some really cute little kids. Because think about it, when we were younger, we'd go to the library and we would sit and the librarian would read a story. This is how we looked. We were kind of enwrapped in the content because people love to hear stories. They're emotive, they're connecting, they bring back memories. We're able to visualize and there's imagery. And so this is something we've lost doing in the corporate world. And in business, we tend to just give facts and give data. I want you to really think about what are those stories, those examples that are really going to bring your presentation to life. Another way to do this too is, sounds silly, but maybe bring in some music, bring in some powerful photos, bring in some client stories, something that's going to connect your people. It could even be something that's non-related to the business. It could be a personal example. It could be something you've observed, maybe a movie or article you've read. But don't miss the storytelling piece in your presentation, even if you have just a few minutes. Now that you've done all that kind of headspace thinking, now it's time to lay it out. And here are a couple of points that you can work through for yourself. So, how are you going to grab their attention? What are those stories? What's the content and the flow? Again, remember, beginning, middle, and end. How are you going to involve them? Really critical. And what's that call to action? Stopping about how to involve them, I even feel in a 5-minute presentation, is there something you can do, a question you can ask? If you're on Zoom or Teams, can you do a polling question? Can you do a chat box? You want to do something that your folks are touching the keyboard or having to respond to you so they don't tune you out, quite frankly. So how do you involve them? We put 2 examples of different ways that you can lay out content. I tend to be the one in the upper corner. I do what we call mind mapping. I'll put my concept in the middle of what I'm trying to get across. And then I just start to lay out all these different components that I've walked through. Some people like to do it more linear. A lot of people just jump right in and they start pulling information and throwing it into slides. Miss the step of really laying it all out. So this could take 5 minutes to do, but again, take all your content, lay it out in a way that makes sense to the audience, not just to you. We talked a little bit about imagery, and do you know, this is an incredible stat that we hear the expression all the time, a picture's worth 1,000 words. When we think about that, do you know that our brains process visual information 60,000 times faster than text-based information? So again, the use of imagery, media, images, video is going to not only retain our attention, it's going to engage us and make it more memorable. So what does this look like? This is where I always say, and if you ever heard the expression, eat this, not that, do this, not that with it. So if you look at these slides, which one is more interesting, more appealing, more memorable, might evoke kind of an emotion or a connection, makes me walk away with knowing what I want? I'm hoping you're saying the one in the upper left-hand corner. Again, less words, actually more important. I don't know about you. I sit through many presentations where it's the wall of text and people read line item by line item. Quite frankly, if you're going to do that, just send out the PowerPoint deck and ask them to read it and you can cancel the meeting. Your job, again, is to tell that story, pull the thread through, make it interesting, engaging, and using examples. Bottom one doesn't do that. And finally, practice. And I know you have crazy schedules and finding time to practice seems like an impossible feat. You could do this as you're walking the dog, as you're walking from meeting to meeting. You need to, though, take at least 5 minutes and kind of run through the order. I tend to do this when I do take my dog out for a walk or I'm someplace quiet. Some people might want to grab a partner and say, hey, do you have 5, 10, 15 minutes that I could just walk through the presentation? Other people like to do a true dry run. You need to figure out what you need to do in order to put your best self forward. Because again, every time we present, people are watching us, not just for content, but how we show up. Not to scare you, but it's really important that you know you're the expert in this information. So here are some things you might want to think about. So after you lay this all out and you kind of do your dress rehearsal, whether it's in your head with someone else, Here are some pointers. What's the most exciting or boring part of this presentation? Maybe what can I cut out? I know I tend to put too much in and then I need to cut things back. If I had to summarize my presentation in one sentence to someone who wasn't there, could I do it? Again, this goes back to key messages. I need to make sure that my presentation is funneled and focused to that kind of statement. What sections can be improved? Maybe you look at a couple of slides and say, wow, they're really messy. Or I don't need a slide here. I'm going to highly encourage you to use less slides and maybe even shut the slides down and have a conversation with people and then turn slides back on. Slides are a great framework and a structure. I do use them. I don't think you can kind of present without them all the time because I think there are visual learners who need to see what you're saying. But at the same time, also think about it's too much, too much. Is there a better story or an example? Can you make it tied more closely? I have to do that a lot too, because sometimes what's in my head doesn't always come out of my mouth the way I want it to. So can I make sure that that story fits? And then bottom line, does my audience know what to do with the information from my presentation? And if I can't instantly say yes, I need to go back and do some tweaking and refining. So a couple of things to do. So practice again, any way that's comfortable for you, but then ask yourself these questions. And if you can put a check mark next to each of these, you've done your job and you're ready to go. A couple of things to remember as we wrap up. I love this cartoon because I'm sure we've all sat in presentations where, again, walls of text and people just talk at you, not with you. So when we look at some of those key points, I think that's one of the most important ones. I always say to people who are nervous about presenting or facilitating, you're just talking to people about something that you know a lot about, that you're excited, maybe passionate about, that you're an expert in, that you want to get people excited about in as well. That's your golden ticket. Just talk to people and show that enthusiasm, show that experience and knowledge. You don't ever get to ask to present on something you don't know about. So again, it's a conversation. Make sure, again, it's in a linear manner. I tend to be kind of more of a global thinker, so I have to stop sometimes and say, this might make sense to me, but the people sitting around the table, does this make sense? Is it linear? Is it structured? Do I have those details that someone who is different than me can understand? Again, then did I illustrate well? I think every presentation should have some kind of story examples. Through this, I told a couple of little stories, gave some examples, started off with something kind of hopefully intriguing, and then practice. Even though I do this for a living, I'm always practicing. I'm always doing a dry run before I get in front of everyone. And bottom line, just relax, take that deep breath. One of my tricks before I go on stage, because years ago I had a great mentor. I was nervous before a presentation and I said to him, why am I nervous? I do this all the time. And he said, Stace, if you're not nervous, you're cocky. So a little bit of that adrenaline, a little bit of that stress is actually your body's way of saying you're getting ready to share something important. So what I do before I start any meeting or walk on stage is I take a couple of deep breaths. I kind of count to 10, believe it or not, and I just kind of pull my shoulders out of my ears, and then I walk out, or then I start. So again, what's your little practice to get yourself ready? So with that, I just want to say thank you for listening to this. Hopefully this is really helpful. Again, this can be used for a presentation that's 5 minutes or 5 hours. Really important to follow these steps in order to deliver your best and most engaging presentation. So if you need any additional help, there's my contact information. Feel free to reach out. Thanks for listening and enjoy the rest of your day.